Hello. Most of this brief introduction to corpus linguistics has assumed that you're using online corpora. This is also the assumption made by Wendy Anderson and myself in our book Exploring English with Online Corpora. However, in our book we also spend a little time discussing corpus design and representativeness. Since text analysis software is becoming more accessible and easier to use, you might wish to begin making your own corpus. And so this session reviews some of the basic concepts in doing so. So today's session will cover the most basic theoretical and practical issues involved in designing your own corpus, mainly that of representativeness. But before we even start thinking of this question, we need to ask, what is my corpus for? So what is my corpus for? As we've seen in this series of talks, there are different possible answers to this question. For example, you might be interested in giving accurate descriptions of spoken or written grammar, lexis, discourse, or phonology. You might be interested in helping non-native speakers to learn English. You might be interested in studying child language acquisition, or to study the features of a particular genre or register. You might be interested in studying the features of a particular geographical or social dialect. You might be interested in improving machine translation or improving natural language processing. You could be interested in using a corpus to study aspects of culture and language use, looking at, for example, hot topics or how different people use language to indicate stance and so on. The purpose of your corpus will determine to a great degree the kind of corpus you decide to build. Its scope, its size, its range and time period will depend very much on what you want it for. So think of a language problem first, before you design a corpus that will address it. Douglas Biber, a pioneer in corpus design, came up late last century in 1993 with a useful cycle of corpus design and refinement that begins, as suggested here too, with a pilot empirical investigation and a theoretical analysis of a language question. Ideally, we begin with a research question and think about ways of analysing data to answer that question. Only then do we design a corpus and annotate it in accordance with our needs, marking it up as appropriate. In other words, first of all, you design the kind of language you want to investigate, and you formulate your research questions and methods of analysis. Then you design your corpus using a sampling frame. We'll come back to that shortly. Next, you compile part of your corpus using your sampling frame. Then you investigate the part of your corpus, modifying your design if necessary. Finally, you go through steps 2 to 5 again, and possibly again, until your funding runs out, or you retire, or you graduate, or whatever. Of course, these 5 steps represent an ideal cycle if you're designing a corpus for your own research purposes. If you're part of a larger collaborative team, you might start compiling and perhaps even annotating a corpus without a very specific set of research questions, beyond something like, I wonder how business meetings are structured, or I wonder what soap opera scripts are like, or I wonder what language is like in New Zealand, or whatever. With the Scottish Corpus of Text and Speech, the initial Scots team just wanted to look at language with a Scottish provenance. In such cases, it's possible to compile corpora and perhaps leave aspects like annotation and markup open, which is what we did with the Scots corpus, creating what might simply be considered an archive of spoken and written documents. And there are strengths and limitations to such an approach. The Corpus of Contemporary American English, or COCA, is an example of a large, ambitious corpus put online for multiple users who might have many different research questions. It's modelled in the British National Corpus, or BNC, but in some significant respects it's different in its design and content. The texts are automatically parsed using a version of Clause, the Lancaster University programme also used with BNC. The design decisions for all corpora impact on the kind of research that can be done with them. The kind of grammatical coding, for example, determines the kind of searches that can be performed. So it's worth looking at COCA's structure in a little bit of detail. COCA, around about early 2017, contains more than 520 million words of text, 20 million words each year from 1990 to 2015, and it's equally divided amongst spoken, fiction, popular magazines, newspapers, and academic texts. For each year, and therefore overall as well, the corpus is evenly divided amongst the 5 registers of spoken fiction, popular magazines, newspapers, and academic journals. The texts in COCA come from a variety of sources. The spoken part of the corpus consists of transcripts of unscripted conversation from more than 150 different TV and radio programs. For example, All Things Considered, NewsHour, Good Morning America, The Today Show, 60 Minutes, Hannity and Combs, and Jerry Springer, and so on. Now we must note here that all the spoken data in COCA is from unscripted media broadcasts, which is very different from other online corpora like BNC or even Scots. If you think about it, the constraints on what you can say on air in the USA must impact on the results you will find in searches of the spoken data in COCA. This does not invalidate any of the results, but we should bear in mind the limitations of any generalizations about speech based on such restricted data, basically only media discourse. The fiction part of the corpus consists of short stories and plays from literary magazines, children's magazines, popular magazines, first chapters of first edition books 1990 to the present, and movie scripts. The sources of other COCA registers are, and these descriptions are taken from the website, popular magazines, nearly 100 different magazines with a good mix overall and by year between specific domains, news, health, home and gardening, women, financial, religion, sports, etc. A few examples are Time, Men's Health, Good Housekeeping, Cosmopolitan, Fortune, Christian Century, Sports Illustrated, and so on. The newspaper data comes from 10 newspapers from across the United States, including USA Today, New York Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, San Francisco Chronicle, etc. In most cases, there's a good mix between different sections of the newspaper, such as local news, opinion, sports, financial, and so on. And finally, the academic journal part includes nearly 100 different peer-reviewed journals. These were selected to cover the entire range of the Library of Congress classification system. That is a certain percentage from B, philosophy, psychology, religion, D, world history, K, education, T, technology, and so on, both overall and by number of words per year. COCA then is an ambitious, well-structured corpus aiming to represent standard American English today. Other, more specialised corpora are much more specific, like the corpus of spoken language in Macau, which is around 30 hours of oral history interviews in English, Portuguese and Cantonese, interviews conducted in that city. And the Michigan corpus of academic spoken English, or MyCase, which is a collection of oral texts in different academic genres at Michigan University, lectures, seminars, advisory sessions, etc. Now these are both much more specialised corpora. Whatever your corpus, whether it's broad like COCA or BNC, or more focused like MyCase or COSLIN, somebody, somewhere, is at some point going to ask you the reasonable sounding question, but is it representative? And probably at some point you're going to ask yourself, is it big enough? These are indeed good questions, but not always ones that are easy to answer. The issue of representativeness is a complex one in corpus linguistics. We can think of representativeness in different ways. It might involve a sample of genres, spoken and written, that is typical of all or some domain of discourse. Or secondly, it might involve a corpus that is representative of the language as a whole, linguistically. For the latter view, Douglas Biber's 1993 article on representativeness in Corpus Design is a key text. But let's think of the first kind of representativeness first. This view argues that a representative sample of a language domain includes a balanced set of the genres that characterize that domain. The Scots corpus nods its head in that direction, as it set up a sampling frame that included for writing the list of genres on this slide. However, the designers of this corpus, of which I was one, quickly found that such a sampling frame was difficult to implement. There's overlap, say, between prose, non-fiction, and essay, diary, and article that requires some cross-coding. In principle, this is okay, as you could cross-code and search the texts in different ways. More problematical is deciding the distribution of content assigned to each genre. If you go for equal distribution, as in COCA or BNC, you need to find enough personal letters, let's say, to balance out the novels, for example, and that is far from easy. If you're going to argue that you're more likely to encounter more invoices, say, than ballads in your life, and that you should have more invoice texts than ballad texts as a consequence, then how do you actually make that calculation precisely? Of course, sampling frames will also change over time. When Scots was designed, we probably thought of email, if we thought of it at all, as a minor type of correspondence. And text messaging, although it had been invented, was not at all popular. It's worth remembering that COCA and BNC do not draw from many of the genres listed on this slide, so can they be thought of as being truly representative? In the end, with the Scots corpus, we gathered the data we thought would be important, opportunistically, and we decided to let the users specify and download subcorpora that they might want to investigate using proportions and distributions that they wanted to make. But this decision makes Scots as a whole an illustrative rather than a representative corpus. That is, it illustrates some language use in Scottish settings, but it's not fully representative of Scottish usages. And to that extent, it is limited. Lovers of statistical rigour, then, might sniff at the Scots corpus and prefer the linguistic representativeness described by Biber. The steps for determining linguistic representativeness are listed on the slide. First, you take a sample of texts from a range of registers like conversation, fiction, academic prose, and so on, and these should be uncontroversial, straightforward examples of each register. Secondly, you select a range of linguistic markers that you're interested in, and crucially, that you can count. For example, nouns, personal pronouns, prepositions, present and past tense markers, and so on. Then you count the number of each feature in your samples. This gives you your raw frequency. You calculate the normalized frequency, for example, the average number of occurrences of each item per 1,000 words or 10,000 words. Then you use a statistical formula to calculate the standard deviation, or SD, the mean variation from the mean. And you finally match other texts against your sample texts, which can be used as a provisional benchmark that your other texts are indeed typical or representative. Now, Biber follows this procedure with a set of texts in different registers from a balanced corpus and comes up with a set of benchmark figures for, say, conversation, general fiction, and academic prose. And so, for example, on the table in this slide, you can see that conversation has, on average, 137.4 nouns per 1,000 words, with a standard deviation of 15.6. In other words, any conversational corpus that is representative, linguistically representative, should have between 121.8 and 153 nouns for any 1,000 words. Any other figures higher or lower than this, and it will be non-representative linguistically, or a bit strange. Note that in Biber's table, fiction is a little bit more noun-rich, with a wider standard deviation, while academic prose is very noun-rich, with a smaller standard deviation than fiction. You might think about why this would be. So let's say that you've designed your own corpus, you've collected your own texts, or perhaps you're using someone else's corpus, and you want to check if the corpus is representative linguistically. You can look at Biber's methods and indeed his figures, dated though they now might be, and you can use them to evaluate other corpora. On this slide, I've put the noun frequencies for Biber's 3 registers against the BNC's categories, and it's worth having a look at them. Now, the mean figures for nouns in the BNC correspond quite closely with Biber's pilot corpus figures in the registers of speech, conversation, and general fiction. The BNC mean scores in these categories fall well within 1 standard deviation in each case. However, the difference between Biber's figures for academic prose and the BNC mean in this category is greater, between 2 and 3 standard deviations. Now, this casts some doubt about whether Biber's pilot corpus or the BNC sample for academic prose is truly representative. To be honest, it's probably Biber's figures that would need to be revised. So, what can we learn from all this discussion? One lesson is that representativeness can mean different things, and while one should worry about it, one should also be aware that there are different ways of addressing what a representative corpus might be. For the more statistically rigorous amongst us, it's possible to determine whether a sample is statistically representative with respect to a particular set of linguistic features. Different corpus sizes are required for different features. For example, quite a small corpus is necessary to be representative of common grammatical features, for example, past versus present tense occurrences. But quite a large corpus is necessary to be representative of even common lexical items, and a very large corpus is necessary if you want to be representative of less common lexical items. The real moral is that if you do decide to design your own corpus and are vexed about its representativeness, don't get too bogged down in statistical issues too early. Begin with a research question and a frame of texts and registers you need to sample to address that question. You can determine the statistical representativeness of the registers later if you want to. Good luck, and thanks, as ever, for watching.